Hello friends of the Effortless Glide, this is the JUSTPADRIDE Snowboard channel. I'm Lars Horstman and today we're going to wax this guy here. And as I wax that board, I'll be talking about snowboard bases, base structure, different waxes, different conditions, what you need to do to prep your board before you start waxing. And I may have a couple little insider tips and tricks around waxing for you here as well. So keep watching and let's go. So what is actually happening when we're snowboarding is that the friction of our board against the snow is melting a little bit of that snow into a micro water film. And this water film under our base is actually what we're gliding on. So any kind of snowboard base material is made out of a plastic that is particularly hydrophobic, and obviously wax, being some form of greasy compound, is hydrophobic as well. So this water film actually creates a bit of a problem. You can try this in your kitchen, grab a cup with a flat bottom, put a drop of water on your kitchen counter and set the cup right into it. You'll get some form of suction, right? And that suction would slow you down on a snowboard. So in order for that to be avoided, manufacturers sometimes choose to put a base structure into the base of your board. That's those length grooves that you see in your board, and they help with transporting the water away from under your board so that you can get gliding. These structures come in all kinds of forms and shapes, and on a snowboard there's one thing to be considered that skiers don't really have to consider, and that is that we are quite often pivoting and sliding sideways. And if your base structure on a snowboard is too coarse, you will hear like this high-pitched zzz noise when you slide down the mountain. And actually the structure in that regard can sometimes even mess with the steering of the board. So on a snowboard, ideally the manufacturer chooses to have a fairly shallow structure. I think one company that does a great job with that is K2. They put that on all their boards, and Ride, I think the structure is the same between the two. So that's a very shallow, nice little structure that helps just about enough with transporting water, but doesn't interfere with the actual pivoting and sliding of a snowboard. The other thing with structure is technically it would require different structures in different conditions depending on the water content in the snow. Now again, on a snowboard you don't want to go too coarse due to the effect that I just explained. But technically anything in spring with high water content would benefit from a deeper structure. While in really cold snow, the structure barely helps at all. Some people are arguing it actually slows you down because any kind of structuring of the base actually creates more base surface, right? You're exposing more base material by cutting grooves into it. So you will see some of the Japanese powerboards, for example, Gentem stick boards, they don't have a structure, or it's so fine that it's invisible to my eye. And yeah, those guys are dealing with powder. That's what the boards are made for, and they choose not to put a structure on the board. Now when it's really cold, and I'm talking like -15 and under, when you get this squeaky noise under your boots as you walk to the lift through the snow, that's when you start dealing with an entirely different problem. The friction of your board against the snow is not enough to actually melt snow into this micro water film that you can then glide on, and what you're dealing with is basically pure abrasion of those really sharp cold snow crystals. And that's basically why it's very difficult to wax for really cold conditions, because the crystals are really so sharp and dig into your base. Now the only way to get around that, this is why there's different waxes for different temperatures, is a really cold wax, and that is wax that is mostly very, very hard. You can generally say warm temperature wax is softer wax and cold temperature wax is harder wax, and that's exactly for those reasons. If you took a warm temperature wax, which is very soft, and took out your board on a very cold day, you can imagine that those sharp crystals would have a much easier time clinging onto that softer wax. So that would actually slow you down on top of the already abrasive effect of those snow crystals. Now, I don't want to go super scientific here, also because I don't know all that much at that depth. But there's one other thing to consider when it's really cold, and that is electrostatic friction. So if you encounter those conditions, super dry, cold snow, graphite waxes actually deal with that friction a little bit better, supposedly. And I would assume that graphite bases also do. So on top of simply using really hard wax in those conditions, having some form of graphite content somewhere is potentially not a bad idea. So why are we actually waxing our boards besides trying to glide well? Some people approach me and say, well, you know what, don't make it too fast, I'm not that good. It's not about maximum speed. It's about being in control over your board because there's less friction. If you think of a vehicle in a parking lot, you're trying to get into your parking spot without power steering. The friction of the tires on the ground plus the lack of power steering will make that really, really difficult, and it's quite a workout. As soon as the car gets going a little quicker, that becomes less of an issue, right? So the same happens with a board. So if you're a beginner and you're arguing, well, I don't want to be so fast, don't think about the top speed. Think about the reduction of friction so that you can steer the board and pivot the board under your feet even at those slower speeds. The other thing we want to achieve with waxing is durability and base protection. So you know how your base looks when it's become dry. It gets all milky, grayish, the colors look faded, or if it's a black base, it goes like really gray, whitish, in particular along the edges. And when that happens, the next step after that is what you call base burn. And that is when the friction of the crystals against your totally dried out base simply tear into the plastic and cause this micro fur, these tiny hairs that are sticking up from the base. The only way to deal with that is a base grind. And obviously every time you grind your base, you lose base material and wear down your base, and eventually that's the end of the lifespan of your board. Keeping your base saturated in order to protect it and to prolong its life brings me straight to the different base materials that are available and their durability. So we need to differentiate between the two big ones, that's extruded bases versus sintered bases. With an extruded base, basically you get the plastic pellets, they're being melted and then pressed into a sheet of base material. With a sintered base, those plastic pellets, same thing, they're being ground down into a powder, and this powder is then pressed under a lot of heat and pressure also into a sheet of base material. Now, if you think of a powder being pressed into a sheet, you can probably envision that between all the granules there's space. So some people would call that the base is porous, but technically it's simply space between these fine granules that the wax can get into. I would personally argue from my experience from dealing with extruded bases, they don't really absorb any wax. It kind of just stays on the surface as a little film, a greasy looking film. But you know, I might be wrong, but yeah, logically with how they are being made, that would also make sense. So within that category of sinter bases, there are different sinter grades, which basically just describes how fine this powder is that is then being pressed into a sheet of base material. A subcategory of sintered bases are the sintered graphite bases. That's mostly race bases, and they have graphite content, and as far as I could find out in my research, they are a little bit faster than the high-end sintered bases without graphite, but therefore not quite as durable, and you need to wax them even more frequently than a high-end sintered base. The least durable in our mix here in regards to abrasion resistance is an extruded base, followed by sintered bases of different grades. So the highest grade sinter base would be the densest, firmest and most durable, most impact resistant. And then there's this subcategory of a race base with graphite content. Now there's one particular issue with those softer bases that is beyond just getting scratched. And what I'm talking about is the base wearing down so quickly along the edges that the boards become what you call edge high really fast. So I've seen boards, I'm not going to name any manufacturers here, I've seen boards that have been ridden only for a few weeks where the base along the edge has worn down so much that when you run a fingernail from the base towards the edge, you actually catch the edge. And this kind of base high kind of situation creates a rail, right? And your board is no longer pivoting freely. And the only way to deal with that is a base grind. Bring the edge down, bring the base down, make it all flat again, give it a new base bevel. Now, if you ride a lot and you have a board like that, and that happens to you once a month, you may well get to the end of the life of your board after that first season. So for me personally, super important criteria when I buy a board is that it has a ideally higher end sintered base that is nice and dense and can absorb a lot of wax and is quite impact resistant. Now, terminology wise, it is after all snowboarding, and companies come up with all kinds of fancy names for the same thing. Liptech has the TNT base that is technically an extruded base. There's apparently some form of Teflon content in there, but it's actually not that much of a high-end base. Then there are some companies calling their bases sintered, where they go like, oh yeah, it's a bit of an in-between. Unfortunately, I can't really comprehend what that would be, considering that the one is melted pellets and the other one is compressed powder. I don't really know how that can be in one and the same base together and then be called sintered. Then what we have, we had a manufacturer a few years ago that called a certain base super extruded, which was simply an extruded base on a slightly higher priced, mid-priced, higher priced board. And to make it sound cool, it was super extruded. So there's a lot of take it with a pinch of salt type terminology out there. So basically you want to just try to find something that is sintered, and if you don't care, you take something that is extruded. Don't get too hung up with all the bean bamboozle wording that companies are using. For example, one thing classic is carbon nanoparticle infused sintered base. Well, that would be a graphite sintered base, carbon nanoparticle. So yeah, like if you don't want to fall for all that stuff, try to find some good information and just buy a good sinter base. Now, whether you need the highest end base and the fanciest thing, I can't answer that for you. Just be aware that, let's say a sintered graphite race base comes with the responsibility of taking care of it properly. If you don't wax that thing frequently, and that might be as much as after every second time you ride the board, that's kind of pointless. It'll just dry out on you and underperform hugely. So what's really more important than getting the highest end base is that it stays tuned, that it stays waxed, that you have the appropriate structure for the conditions. Unfortunately, with a snowboard, you don't want to mess with it all that much. Find a nice fine structure that works pretty much everywhere, and then keep that thing waxed. A lot of experienced people that I've spoken to in the past are basically saying the most important thing is proper, frequent maintenance and keeping your base saturated at all times. One little side note on base color. Sometimes I hear people say, oh, I'm going to buy the board with the black base because the black bases are the fastest. Now, unfortunately, that's a misconception. The black color does not give away the material. This could well be a fully extruded base and not very high quality at all. Black is nice for the reason being that if you have PTEX fixes to be done, dripping black PTEX into this base pretty much is invisible afterwards. So it's easy to maintain and keep it look good. But that's really about it. What is important to me is ideally I have a board that doesn't have a die cut. Die cut is basically where, let's say, the company name is written in the base, and the colors really pop, and then you see, oh, the letters are actually a different colored piece of PTEX, and it's inlaid into the rest. So some manufacturers do that extremely well, and you cannot feel that at all, and even after years you can't. But I have seen quite a few boards where those letters eventually at some point start delambing, and you start with a fingernail, you start feeling the corners of the letters. That's obviously not ideal, and sometimes even a base grind can't really fix that. So I prefer a sintered, full-on, all-black base, for the reason being less friction due to lack of die cut, and also simply it's easier to fix. All right, enough talking, let's get going here. Things you need to do, very important. Remove your bindings for two reasons. Reason number one is they're simply in the way. They constantly hit the workbench, the straps get in the way, the high backs get in the way. Then later on, when you've scraped the board, there's like shavings everywhere, there's like wax dripping on the heel cups. Just get rid of the bindings. It's better for the bindings, and it makes your life at the workbench much easier. Second and more important reason is the mounted binding with the screws pulling on the inserts of your board will leave dimples in the base of the board. You can see that when you've waxed the board and you've scraped it, that there's those 4 round little dimples right where your binding was or is mounted. And you can't get the wax out of those dimples, and that's basically insert suction through your screws. Now, when you combine that suction or that force of the screws with the high heat of your iron, I cannot imagine that that is a good combination simply for the life of your board, right? Like, and I don't want those dimples in my base. So my bindings, I also don't store my boards with bindings on, really. I personally don't get the idea of having a quiver of boards and every board has a binding. I mean, sure, it's convenient to just grab it off the rack and carry it to the hill, but considering that for every kind of maintenance, like doing edges or waxing, you remove the bindings, if you want to be a good guy or girl, you remove your bindings anyways, then you're constantly messing with them regardless. So why not just having maybe 1 or 2 pairs of bindings for your 6 snowboards and getting used to a quick binding swap? It is clearly the way to go for maintenance jobs. Next thing is edge tuning. If your board needs edges done, you will have to do this before you wax. If you run a file guide over a freshly waxed base multiple times, first of all, you mess up the file guide. You get like all kinds of gunky wax on that glide plate. It's unnecessary and silly. Secondly, like file shavings stick much easier to a waxed base than to a dry base. So like it's basically just a mess, and it's the wrong way around. You want to do edges before you wax. Now, if your board doesn't need a full edge tune, what you want to do regardless before waxing is check your edge, your base edge in particular, for rock burrs. Those sharp little metal burrs will simply scratch the sole of your iron and damage it over time. You don't want to do that. Everything about edge tuning is popping up in this video here on the banner. 1 hour edge tuning tutorials, got everything in there that you need. Just here for the short tip, if you need to remove burrs, use an aluminum oxide stone like these guys here with water, or a coarse diamond. This is a 200 grit Sidecut Tools diamond stone. You can use those things to simply, without much pressure being applied and the use of some water, wear down those burrs and smooth out your base edge to save your iron. Then people will ask, do I have to clean my base with base cleaner before I wax? Base cleaner, I use this stuff here from Coos Boards. That's a citrus solvent basically, and it dissolves grease and gets dirt out of the base. That's beautiful, but also it dries the base out because it is a solvent after all. I don't like that. I want my bases, if they don't need to be actually cleaned with a solvent, I want them to stay as saturated as possible, and all I do to clean the surface is use a brass brush before I wax, or a Fibertex pad. One of these guys here, Fibertex. You just put that under your palm and run that from tip to tail over your base, and that will get rid of, you know, maybe there's a micro layer of wax still on there. You can see this right here. There you go. We'll get rid of that, and it will also get rid of dirt that is in the base because it is mildly abrasive, right? The only reason that I see for base cleaner, like the actual solvent, is in the springtime when your base actually sucks up all that dirt that is in the snow. And on a black base, unfortunately, you can't really see that. It's a bit funny to figure out whether you need base cleaner or not. But on a base with any kinds of colors, lighter colors, you will see that instantly. The base basically gets kind of brown, grayish, gunky. And that is where you may then actually need the solvent, or in the worst case scenarios, because it's so deeply in there, you even need a base grind. But otherwise, using a brass brush or a Fibertex pad will simply prep the base, as in it'll open up the base structure a little bit for the wax to penetrate the base a little easier, and it'll also remove superficial dirt. Besides a brass brush and or that Fibertex pad to prep the base, we also want a clean rag of sorts. Always have one of those handy in your workshop, particularly if you need base cleaner. You gotta get rid of that stuff, right? You spray it on and then wipe it off after a while. So you need a rag, and then obviously we need wax, and we need an iron, and we need a scraper to scrape the wax off. And then also we need certain brushes. We'll get there later. So some people will just go and use mom's clothing iron. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. There are some specific things about waxing irons. I'm using this guy here. It's a Sidecut iron, digital, and gives me really nice fine control over the temperature. Things about this are the dimples in the base here, basically, or in the sole of the iron, basically help with the glide of the iron. What you don't want is an iron that gets stuck on the base through the development of suction. That can become pretty dangerous. If you can't move the iron and it's actually really stuck somehow, you can quite quickly burn your base and overheat that spot. You don't want that, so this helps with the glide, those little dimples here. And then also the entire side of this, the entire edge, is basically beveled. So I'm not pushing the wax away, but it actually stays under the iron quite nicely, so I can distribute it evenly. The big thing here is the sole thickness of your iron. A thicker sole, and that is where your money goes, simply keeps the heat much longer, much more evenly, distributes the heat more evenly, and you will have to deal much less with temperature fluctuation. And you know, when you deal with warm waxes, that's kind of less of an issue really. But when you deal with very hard waxes for those cold days, you simply want your iron to stay hot. It becomes a bit of a pain in the butt when you have those waxes that need higher iron temperatures, and your iron temperature is constantly dropping and nothing melts and you're waiting again. So if you wax often, it's well worth the money to buy something with a thicker sole and all these little features that are just laid out here. For the attentive people among you, my background just changed. The board that was standing there, the white one, is now on the bench. This is my Stranda Pipeliner prototype, and what happened is that I went ahead and waxed the board and explained everything for you, and then realized it was all recorded in time lapse and it's useless. So we continue where we left this conversation here. In regards to applying the wax, some people will say that you shouldn't ever bring the hot iron in direct contact with the base, without there being any wax. And there are different ways to avoid that. And you can either just take a block of wax and rub a thin layer all over the board, or what you can also do is use like the crayon on method, where you basically just hold the block against the iron for a second, melt a little, and apply it like this. So the thing about method number one is that this here is not enough wax, right? So you would, on top of this, you would have to do the standard drip method, basically just covering the base in drops of wax that you will then distribute evenly. So technically, I feel like the crayon method saves you a step. It will potentially also save you wax. And now this is already covered, and I can straight up go there and spread out the wax. Okay, now that I've covered my base, I'm ready to simply take my iron and spread it out evenly. At this stage, I don't really have to be very careful with anything other than not overheating a particular spot of the base. You want to keep your iron moving at all times until all the wax is melted and distributed across the base evenly. All right, so everything's distributed evenly. What I'm doing now is slow, even tip to tail passes to make sure that I really get the wax into the base, and I've been everywhere and I didn't miss a spot. The idea here is that the iron leaves a trail of melted wax behind that ideally isn't longer than maybe at the longest a foot. If you get to the tail of your board and the nose is still dripping wet with wax, you are likely moving too slowly, or maybe your iron temperature is a little bit high. In regards to iron temperature, you can basically say if the manufacturer of the wax didn't print the iron temperature on the packaging, you can use a rough guideline. I feel comfortable going with that about 120 degrees Celsius for warm temperature, softer wax, and then about 130 for all temp and 140 for cold temp. Some cold temperature waxes require even hotter irons. This is a bit of a guess or an average from all the manufacturers that I've seen, but there's a simple method to determine whether your iron is too hot. Whenever it's developing steam, you want to turn it down, because then you are basically just burning wax. If you ride your edges quite hard and you carve a lot, and you're experiencing that your base is drying out along the edge much quicker than the rest of your board, and you are kind of annoyed with having to wax the whole board just because it's been drying out along the edge so quickly, what you could try is apply a line, like drip one line of cold temperature wax right down the edge, because that wax is harder, it's denser, it's a little bit more resistant to abrasion, and potentially that does work with some bases on some boards. You might get away with larger intervals between waxing. You need to let the board cool down to room temperature, or, you know, if it's still like a little lukewarm, it's probably not the end of the world, but ideally let it cool down. Let it cool down to room temperature. Don't scrape off your wet wax. It can't really get into the base if you are too quick scraping it off. For scraping, we want a sharp scraper, and if you don't have a particular tool to sharpen this thing, there's a very simple trick that I'm going to show you. All you need for that is a piece of a 2x4 and a piece of sandpaper. Here you go. and you basically just put the sandpaper down on your workbench and the 2x4 on top of it. Use that as a guide for your scraper. Set that against the 2x4 onto the sandpaper and give it a good sharpen. Your other option is using an actual scraper sharpener with a file that is in there. And with these guys, you just insert your scraper into that slot and run it over the file a few times. You want to make sure that you don't have any jagged corners in your blade here. So sometimes if you have a scraper sharpener, you may end up needing to smooth this out with that sandpaper method as well. Once you're ready with this, you basically just scrape your board tip to tail in one direction, and you do that by holding the scraper. I hope you can see this. Basically like this, tilt the top edge away from you and push your thumbs into the center, but don't flex the scraper. You're just going to create too much pressure here in the middle, digging into your base. So basically you just want some mild pressure on your thumbs. Tilt that top edge away. And scrape it all off. And when I say scrape it all off, I mean all off. You don't want any wax left on your base. It's not rare that you have to resharpen your scraper as you go. In particular with big boards like this guy, my cheater is 170 with a 275 waist. It's a lot of base, and those scrapers get dull fairly fast. So you may have to resharpen as you're scraping a single board. That's not rare. If you want to be really sure that you've gotten all the wax off, you can run your hand over the base. You will, with practice, develop some sensitivity for those dull spots. Whenever your hand starts like to stick to the base, then you know there's a dull spot with a little bit of wax left. I got one right here, and you can see just a little more coming off. Before brushing, you want to make sure that you have all your wax off your edges as well. Your scraper will likely come, you can see this here, I put my thumb behind it in black. You can see this little corner cut out of it. And that corner, you just set that onto your edge. So you're basically scraping base and side edge simultaneously. And you just want to make sure that there's no drip drops that run down the side and are covering your edge with wax. All right, last step here is brushing. I am starting with a nylon brush. And the reason why we brush is basically, since we have a base structure that I explained earlier, we don't want to clog up that structure, right? Like we want these channels for the water to run off. So we need to free those channels of wax, and the scraper can't get in there, but these fine bristles can. So you go tip to tail, that's important, only in one direction. I start with a nylon brush, followed by horsehair. A roto brush used with a drill is obviously the ideal and quick solution to this. But if you don't have that, these hand brushes do a great job. And you will see when you finish with horsehair, those stiff, fine bristles really get even more wax removed from the base, out of the structure, and it almost acts a bit as a polishing. Like whenever I use the horsehair at the very end, my base gets all shiny and starts to look really good. You can see here how there's super fine wax powder that I can still remove with the horsehair. I can show you this here. There you go, right? This, although I scraped really thoroughly and I used nylon already, is still coming off the base. All right, that's it. That's my shiny base. The last thing that I do to remove any kind of dust particles that are still on there, I simply use a clean rag and gently wipe that off. Hasn't done me any harm doing this. But yeah, I stop at the horsehair, and that's the way I tune my boards, and I'm fast enough. I'm not racing. I'm quite certain there are ways to polish a base to absolute perfection with certain things. Some people will tell you use the Fibertex pad again. I disagree with that because these things are quite abrasive and actually will remove that little bit of wax that I still want on there after scraping and brushing. So I'm not doing that. I think there are other pads that might be more like nylon and less abrasive that you can use for this, but honestly I wouldn't know. Maybe somebody can comment who has that knowledge, whether there's any other steps to be done to polish it even better. Alright, that's it from me for waxing for today. I hope you're going to be able to use some of these things for yourself. If you're not taking care of your board already, I hope this will inspire you to do so in the future. It is well worth the effort, and it doesn't cost all that much to get a waxing kit together, so you actually start taking care of your base and prolong the life of your board. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, share what you've seen with your friends if you liked it, get the notifications so you know what's dropping here next, and hopefully you will have a very happy end to the season. It is already April and there's not that much time left for 2024 here. Alright, take care everyone, see you out there, bye bye.